been a few weeks since my last Beetlejuice video where I started constructing the walls. Let me catch you up to speed with what I have done since that video.
I've done nothing!
You are now up to speed. But in that video, I asked you if you wanted me to continue with the construction process or stop and do decorating along the way. I had a lot of responses, and I think the majority wanted me to decorate along the way, and you made a lot of really good points, as in it would be a lot easier for me to do that, and it will keep me more interested in the project. So, today I'm going to be working on the dining room, which is the room that I put the walls up in the last video. There's going to be a few techniques that I have used before and some new techniques, so let's get started. Here are the walls that I put up last time. I have this opening in the front, and that goes between the dining room and the living room. This is the dining room scene from the movie. I'm wanting you to focus more, I know the actors are really awesome, but the textures in the back are what I'm focusing on here, which is a paneled wall that is marbled, and that's going to need to go on both sides of the dining room, and then the opening that goes into the living room is going to have some kind of stone texture. Because the walls are already constructed, I'm going to be making the wall panels separately and then gluing them on. I'm using some old scrapbook paper, and I'm marking out how I need to cut it so that it fits perfectly on the wall. Once I have that complete, I know that I have a surface that I can start building my panels on. I'm going to do this for both of the side walls, so the other one's going to have a hole in it because there's a door. I mark the top just to make sure that I get it right. Just in case my walls don't have exact 90-degree angles, I like to make sure I remember where the top is. I'm making a 2" by 2" grid on my paper. This is what I found worked best for the area of my wall, and I'm going to be centering some beams on these lines. I could have measured out the beam thickness, but I just decided to eyeball and mark the center lines for each piece. These are 1/2" wide pieces of chipboard, which is cereal boxed like material, and I am cutting them at 1/2" strips. However, the top and bottom strips are a bit thicker to make sure I compensate for the floorboard and the crown molding, which I will be putting on later. Once I have them glued down, I can cut off the excess on either side. I do end up regretting later on that I put the chipboard strips on such a flimsy material because they dry a little bit differently, and I feel like if I had built the wall panels on top of another piece of chipboard instead of the flimsy scrapbook paper, it would have been less frustrating down the line when things started to warp. So the next time I do this, I will make sure that my back wall panel is something a little bit stronger than the scrapbook paper. To make the vertical lines on my grid, I'm using the same exact 1/2" thick pieces, and I am cutting them so that they fit in between my horizontal pieces. I do have another video on wall paneling if you want something with a little bit more instructions on measuring and not just eyeballing it. It's for my captain's quarters, and I will leave a link to that down below in the description. But because this wall is eventually going to have marbling all over it, I didn't feel like I had to be too precise, and I'm just eyeballing it. It does end up looking fairly good in the end, so it worked out. I'm now using a strip of chipboard that I cut that is just slightly smaller than the opening in the center. I'm marking and cutting it down so that there is an equal gap that goes all the way around the top and the sides. This is what's going to create the paneled effect. I also noticed that it is beveled, and beveling is really hard to cut by hand with an X-Acto blade. My favorite way to do this is to hold the piece of whatever you want to bevel at an angle and drag it along some sandpaper. This creates just a tiny little bevel and takes away that really sharp edge. It's not as beveled as it is in the reference of the video, but I think it works out for this piece. So here's my final panel. I did everything the same way, where I just went through and carefully cut out the pieces. I also did this other wall with the door opening. All I did for this was add a couple of lines that go on either side of the door, and then there's a smaller piece that goes above the doorway. Now I have my panels. I also created one more that's going to go above the entrance that passes through from the dining room to the living room. Now it's time to add a base coat to all of these panels. I am using Royal Blue, made by Anita's All-Purpose Acrylic, and as many people pointed out on my Instagram, it looks like TARDIS blue, which totally works for me. I'm going to cover everything and make sure to get into all of the gaps because this is going to be the base coat that's going to have all the marbling on top of it. I did notice quite a bit of warping, and this is when I started to get concerned about my choice of using the scrapbook paper. It really starts to warp a little differently than the chipboard, and I really wish I had used chipboard on the back. So just keep that in mind if you decide to do this. I'm going to cover everything with Mod Podge. It's already warped, so I'm not really worried about it warping more. I'm going to use the Mod Podge to cover every single part of it. This is going to make the marbling, which includes a lot of water work, a little bit easier. To help try and fight the warping, I am making sure that most of the Mod Podge has dried on the surface. There is a bit you can see like in the corner where there's not quite dried Mod Podge, and I'm going to layer everything underneath some wax paper, cover it with something heavy so that it will continue to dry while it is flat, and that really did help combat the warp. As I'm going through each step, I'm trying to keep myself on track with a to-do list, and next I'm going to marble the panels. I allowed these to dry completely overnight and grabbed some paints that I thought would work for the overall marbling effect. I also pre-cut some baseboards and crown molding to go ahead and paint them. I can't install them yet because I won't have the floor installed, but it's going to be an interesting paint job, so it's better to do them now. I watched several videos on marbling, and this was full-size furniture that I was watching it on, and I'm trying to translate it to a smaller miniature wall. The key I learned was a lot of water and a lot of layers. So I'm adding watered down paint and then going back. The hard thing is that most people are not marbling on a paneled surface. So I struggled with some of the techniques that I learned watching the example videos and ended up using a lot of paper toweling and going in and trying to remove some of the puddling that was happening in the grooves. I know it looks really light here on camera, and it wasn't as light in person, but I did want to start with a lighter color and a lighter layer as I was starting to figure out what I was doing. Then I went in with the darker green, which I ended up adding a little bit more blue into, but I think adding green and not just blues really helped it a lot. And as you can see, I'm also splattering some paint as well. And that helped too with marble's kind of chaos. You have to add some little bit of chaotic energy in there, I think. The white ended up being a little bit too strong, so I added some water on top of it, and then I went back with some blue, and it's just really a process of kind of playing with it. After I was happy with my background, larger strokes of paint, I needed to do my foreground strokes, which are much thinner and more delicate. These are the little tiny veins of color that you're used to seeing in marbled surfaces. This took a lot more time, but it was really fun to go back and forth and try and create random strikes of color throughout the marbled wall. I used the same colors that I used in the background, but they were just a little bit more concentrated. And I did notice that on camera it looks just kind of like a mess right now because you're seeing the shiny Mod Podge against the matte acrylic paint, but in the end I do cover the entire thing with a glossy coating, and I think that makes everything look a little bit nicer because it all looks like it's made from the same material. So here's my final paint job on the marble, and it looks a little bit better in person, I will say. And here's the other wall. I decided once I was done to go over everything with a coat of watered down blue, and this is just because I wanted to dull down the white a little bit. And I did that on all of my panels and let them dry completely before I put on the glossy coat. All in all, I'm pretty happy with how these came out in the end. And now a note from editing era. I want to really quick break in here and just say sorry about the camera shakes. I am working on that. I've got this new boom arm thing here, which is attached to the table, which the boom arm is great, but the table is a little shaky anytime I touch it. I tried to edit out a lot of the shaking, but I'm going to work on something a little bit different for next time. So while my panels are drying completely, I need to do some prep work on the rest of the room. The opening that passes from the dining room, which we're working on, into the living room has this stone texture, which I'm going to have to get with spray paint. To prep the foam board, I'm going to need to cover all the exposed foam on the edges. This is because spray paint typically melts foam. To do this, I'm taking some wood glue and just putting it on my finger and running it along the edge of the foam board. This is going to create a protective coating so that it doesn't melt along the way. Yes, this is kind of a gross process. The edges all around the interior of this walkthrough area are also going to be covered with a layer of chipboard. I measured out the thickness of the wall and then I'm gluing it in place. This is just going to make it look a little bit more cohesive, because if I sprayed it without the covering on it, you might still be able to see that it's two separate pieces of foam board glued together. I also need to make these little platforms on either side of the opening, because these are going to be where the decorative columns are going. So I'm doing a platform kind of at the top underneath the archway. It's not really an arch, but that's what I'm going to call it. And then below. So here you can see I'm measuring out the column. It's a square, so I'm using one of these square dowel pieces of wood, and they're going to, well, I'm just trying to make sure that they fit. To create the top and bottom of the columns and make them a little bit more decorative, I'm going to be using paper wrapping to achieve this effect. I cut a strip of paper about a 1/2 inch thick, and I'm going to be adding glue and carefully wrapping it around the dowel. And I'm trying to make sure that it sticks with the square shape, because you can definitely see in the movie that they are square. Adding the little bit of tacky glue helps me keep it in place as I go around. Then I add a little bit more to the end and make sure that it takes hold. Next, I cut a slightly thinner piece of paper, and this is going to be my next stair step on the column decoration. I'm going to do the same thing where I wrap it around and make sure that I glue it along the way so that it stays stuck. Once it's done, I have a decorative bottom. I'm going to do the same thing to the top of the column and do that for both of my column pieces. These are now ready to go into their place. I'm using tacky glue to glue these in because I typically have a little bit of a longer working time with tacky glue, and it doesn't cause any problems with taking paint if I kind of make a mess as I'm trying to slide it into place. Now it's time to work on these frames you see that are underneath the area with the columns. I want to take a moment to point out that I'm only putting one of the little frames on the wall when in a scene you see two. And the reason I'm doing this is because, well, throughout this entire project, I'm going to be trying to capture the essence of the interiors, even though it may not be perfectly the same. As many of you pointed out in some of my previous videos, the entire Beetlejuice set was exactly that. It was a set. The rooms that you see in the videos were not actually inside the house. So now that I'm trying to force all these spaces inside of one house, and specifically a dollhouse, which needs to be small enough to fit in my room, it's going to be interesting, kind of like a puzzle. So I'm taking a bunch of elements that you see in the films and tailoring them down to fit. I did this with my Addams Family project as well, but it wasn't as noticeable because there's so many different variations with the Addams house. However, with Beetlejuice, there is one house, one set, and so it's going to be a little bit more apparent when I can't fit everything in. Because these frames are so small and delicate and I needed to make 4 of them that needed to be exactly the same, I decided to use my laser cutter for this part of the project. Probably this whole entire house is going to be a mixture of my hand building things and machine building things. I'm using Inkscape to map out what I think looks like the pattern of the doors, and then I'm going to be using my laser cutter to cut out 8 of them because I want to do a double thickness from chipboard, and then I will glue them together to make the final frames. I'm gluing 2 of these together, and I'm using this Zig 2-way glue pen, which is really helpful on tiny skinny things that you want to glue together. I'm gluing 2 because I want to give it a little bit of depth, and I'm going to back these with a mirror. In the video, or in the, I keep saying video, but it's a movie. In the movie, it looks like it's see-through, like you can see from the dining room into the living room. So in order to keep myself from having to cut through the foam board and make the interior of the cabinet, I'm going to trick the eye by using a mirror glued onto the back of these frames, and hopefully that will look like there's something on the other side of the wall. I'm going to put a base coat of white on these so that when I spray paint them, they're the same color as the wall. These are going to go down like this, and they're going to go on both sides, so on the exterior and on the interior. I want to avoid getting the textured spray paint on most of the surfaces because that will make it a little bit more difficult for me to glue things down, such as the floor. So I'm going to be using some construction paper that's left over from some kids' projects, and I'm going to be taping those down to try and protect my foam board. I couldn't find gray textured paint, so I got the textured paint, and then I'm going to do a second coat of gray paint on top of it once the textured is dry. I'm not going to show me trying to spray paint this outside because we have mosquitoes that as soon as you walk outside, they're on you, and so I was moving as fast as I could and I didn't really take the time to set up cameras, but typical spray painting, point and shoot the can, you know. After spray painting the first coat, I could really start to tell where there were some gaps in between the chipboard that I added and the foam board walls. I was also really glad that I went ahead and protected my foam board because you can see it oversprayed quite a bit, and I'm going to have to sand some of this off when I start laying down the floor. I'll probably keep these papers for later. These will be my spray painting cover papers. At the same time, I spray painted these frames so that they look like they match the wall. But before I can add them on, I need to go ahead and fix those gaps. I'm using a little bit of joint compound and I'm smoothing it into any of the gaps that I see. And I'm doing this all the way around, trying to think about what will be visible once I build the rest of the house. In order to keep from having to cover up everything and spray paint it again, I just added a large puddle of spray paint on my palette, so just sprayed it for a couple seconds while it pooled, and then used a paintbrush. I'm making sure to use a paintbrush that I don't care about too much in case the spray paint ruins it, and then I just went over the areas where I added the joint compound. I glued the frames with some Fabri-Tac glue onto this mirror paper, and this is what's going to make my little frames that go on the inside and the outside of the walls. Once I added the Fabri-Tac, which is an acetone-based glue, to the back, it fogged up and I kind of worried that it was going to stay that way, but it did eventually clear up. And I do really like the effect that it gave. And sorry for my head being in the shot so much. I was trying to make sure I was keeping everything as straight as possible. There's a few things that bug me as being a little bit crooked, but we're just gonna keep moving on. Now it's time for what I have been waiting for. It's time to add these marbled blue panels into this plain white room, and it's going to change it up really quickly. Because of the warp problem I mentioned earlier, I had to be very careful about how I installed the wall panel. I used my 1, 2, 3 blocks and clamps to try and keep everything as flat as possible while it dried. I do hope that Delia would have approved. I'm honestly kind of thinking now that I should have made a Delia doll instead of a Beetlejuice doll to start out with, because she cares a lot more about these interiors than Beetlejuice does. He does not care. Maybe I'll have to make her soon. Here's the final outcome after everything is glued in place. I did have my husband say it was looking a little bit under the sea, and I did notice that my walls are much more blue, and in the movie they're a little bit more teal, but I do know that the kitchen is bright blue. And I think once I get all the modern furniture in there, it will not look so oceany. That's my hope, at least. But so far, I'm happy with it, and I think it's a really great start to what is some really exciting interiors in this house. You may have noticed that the back wall, or the magnet wall, which is probably the most exciting part of this room, which will be the sculpture display, has not been made yet. I did not have time this week, but I think that will be the next focus. I'm going to have to make those little blue window tiles, which are going to be such an interesting thing to make. So this ended up being about 3 days worth of work, and that's because of all the dry time. Every single surface, everything I created had to dry multiple times, and there was just a lot of waiting. So 3 days for 3 walls. This is going to be a long project. But that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun trying to figure out some new techniques to try and match the crazy interiors that are inside of the Beetlejuice house. If you have any ideas or suggestions, be sure to leave them down in the comments. I always read through them. I also want to thank you so much to everyone who's reached out and sent me little bits of knowledge that they have, or floor plans, or ideas on how the house goes together. I've really enjoyed the back and forth on trying to figure out this giant puzzle of a house. I hope you all have an amazing week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! A dramatic reenactment of me trying to spray paint outside in the summer in Texas, starring wood glue.